Welcome back to Open, Performing the News. That is the name of the new book written by producer, professor, and podcaster Elia Powers. In the book, he takes a deep look into diversity, representation, authority, and what he calls the myth of neutrality in radio and television news. He also outlines the challenges faced by news professionals from marginalized communities to have careers in broadcasting. To tell us about the book and its findings, we welcome via Skype Elia Powers. Hello, Elia.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to see you. For the sake of disclaimer, I am one of the case studies featured in the book. Fascinating reading. I'll share my thoughts during the interview. Elia, what motivated you to write this book and say there's an issue here that is worth looking into and writing about?
Absolutely. Well, so I'll start with the personal. I had a stutter when I was a younger journalist. That was my previous career. And I really wanted to go into broadcasting, but I just kind of had the feeling, no one ever told me directly, but I kind of had the feeling that it was going to be difficult for me to be on air. So that just was my personal experience with it. More recently, I started to see on social media, especially, a lot of journalists in public radio and on television being more forthcoming about their experiences in broadcasting, being told that their accent, wasn't professional, or their hair wasn't professional. And I just felt like there was a lot of people whose stories were waiting to be told in a more systematic way. So I was really interested in that. And then lastly, I also teach podcasting at my university. And I just wanted to have a better sense of how to talk to my students about what the norms are for voice if they go into the profession. So those were the three main reasons.
Right now, Elia, according to the book, and I'm still in the middle of reading it, I'm enjoying it very much. What is happening?
Yeah, so what I talk to the journalists in the book about is just their experiences, again, not only when they get into newsrooms, but before that, starting even in college and when they're starting to think about a job in broadcast journalism. So, as I trace in the book, a lot of journalists, and I focus mostly in public radio and in local television, are being, kind of coming up and kind of thinking, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to be on television because of my appearance, or my voice is it, I don't have a voice for radio, so to speak. And so some of them, without even, having any conversations or actually even trying, are just deciding, that I'm not going to go into broadcasting because I'm not going to have a chance. Others are going through the pipeline and are feeling along the way that sort of they don't fit in, or that in order to get a job, they're going to have to hide their accent, straighten their hair, or not appear on air with natural hair, maybe change their delivery, change a lot about who they are and how they want to appear on television and on radio. And so that just makes, journalists from historically marginalized communities sort of feel lesser than, and feel like they really have to conform, and they really have to be not authentic in sort of how they're performing on air. But recently we are seeing some movement. I mean, one of the things that I trace in the book is a lot of journalists are pushing those boundaries. And so we are seeing in radio and television, and definitely on podcasting, much more, I think openness, and journalists are trying to really say, I want to present on air the way I want to present. I want to have more control over who I am and who I present, because the audiences need to see a better representation of the entire country, not just, a small slice.
How many journalists did you interview for the book? And also, how long did it take you to work on this? Because I remember my interview was a few years ago.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, so I started working on the book back in the spring of 2021. And so it took several years. Most of the interviews were conducted the first year or two. I interviewed, I think, more than 20 current or former on-air journalists and those of podcasting. And then as well, I interviewed producers, news directors, others in management. Interestingly, I talked to some voice coaches and appearance consultants about their experience, because they're pretty influential also in giving advice to journalists about how to appear. So really, I interviewed, dozens of people who either were on air or were in front of a microphone, or had some role in helping journalists to sort of figure out how they're going to perform for audiences. That's where the title comes from, performing the sort of performative part of the news.
Now, Elia, what you describe in the book is a very fair X-ray, across the board, real landscape of discrimination within the radio and television industry based on looks, sound, body shapes, and other criteria. What is the impact of this issue going unexamined and unspoken?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, journalists that I spoke to, there were sort of several categories when I asked them, how did this affect you? I mean, there was both sort of the just personal psychological effect, feeling like they're not good enough as they are, that they really have to change aspects of who they are, and they sort of feel like, if they're not able to present in the way they want to present, that they just it actually hurts their journalism, like that they're in not being authentic, they sort of feel like they have to hide something, and that actually leads them to feel like they can't give of themselves like they want their interview subjects to do that. Also, there's just a financial cost to this. I mean, frankly, a lot of the journalists, especially when it comes to hair and makeup and that type of stuff, I mean, there's some built-in cost of doing that, but some of them, spent lots and lots of their own personal money just trying to appear, so that their news managers will sort of feel like they're palatable to the general public. And then there's also, if you're spending a lot of time worrying about, your appearance and trying to reduce your accent and, change the way that you speak, I mean, that's time that you're not spending on the reporting part of it. And, Javier, being a journalist is tough work, and it definitely requires a lot of your time. So if you're having to spend a lot of your time sort of managing your presentation, you're at a disadvantage professionally as well.
Now, that is the impact upon news professionals, but you also mention in the book the impact upon audiences in terms of the product, the news product that they are receiving. Please tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. So yeah, certainly, I mean, viewers and listeners, I think want to be seen on television. I mean, I've heard so much that journalists who said that they had heard from audience members once they were able to feel like they were freed up to speak the way they wanted to have some more agency over how they appear, that audiences just responded positively, right? I mean, I think the news should look and sound like the entire country, right? It should be, you should be represented on air. And so certainly, I mean, there have been in public radio, for instance, there's sort of long been a concern about certain, I mean, just to be honest, white, older listeners who have been the kind of primary audience for public radio, at least for a long time, complaining about, well, someone sounds different than I'm used to, and television, similar things are also the case. And so I think, but I mean, for the most part, I mean, I argue that I think audiences, you hear the word distracting used a lot. The concern as well, if your look or sound different than what audiences are used to, the audience will be distracted. Well, I argue in the book that things become less distracting once they're normalized, right? If you see people or hear people with accents or see people that look like you, it's less distracting in the end.
I see the book has been published by Rutgers University Press. What is the release date and how can people get it? Because this is not only directed at teachers and people in media, but to everyone.
Yeah. So it's out very soon. So September 13th is the official release date. I already have, you can see a copy behind me. So it's out in some form. But yeah, you can order it anywhere you get your books online, obviously through Rutgers, through any online bookseller. Support your local bookstore. Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping the book is not only aimed for professional journalists, but people in academia who, teach students, people in the industry, voice coaching and performance coaching industry, I think would also be well served by just kind of getting a sense of how their advice to journalists affects their careers. And so hopefully anybody interested in diversity and inclusion and in media, generally speaking, or even beyond, also might be interested.
What's the importance, Elia, that everyone really becomes engaged into media affairs and media watching, really observing media behavior? It's something that my parents, who were working class, or are working class because my mother still lives, we're constantly looking upon. And I see that society right now, as credibility and trust in regular mainstream media or traditional media is deteriorating, they're tuning out. That's very dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why, I mean, I focus a lot on broadcasting is, it's still in podcasting is, it's still the way that a lot of people get their news. Yeah, it's certainly important. I mean, there's been several studies that have shown that, especially with local news, communities that have a strong local news presence where people actually are, involved and engaged in reading, the civic ties of the community are stronger. I mean, people are more likely to vote, more likely to volunteer, be civically engaged. So yeah, consuming news, and especially local news, right? There's still a lot of national news out there. Local news has struggled more as far as, especially in print. But yeah, certainly very important to follow news locally, not only to be informed around elections we're coming up on now, but just to stay involved and know what's happening in your community and feel a connection. And so I see that, I always tell my students who are mostly in journalism, and some of them, don't always stay up on the news, that the first most important thing for your career and is just to be involved and to read and listen. You have to, and that goes for anyone who wants to be an informed citizen.
The book proposes very thought-provoking and logical solutions. It centers a lot into the concept of normalizing a difference within television and radio news. So can you tell me a little bit about that? And also, how is podcasting starting to change the landscape? For example, at home, we're watching many podcasts done by African Americans and also people in other countries with very marked accents, including Africa.
Yeah, I'll start with your second question first. So podcasting, I have a chapter in the book on podcasting, is really been, I think, pushed broadcasting and people in broadcasting to change somewhat. I spoke to several journalists who had started in radio, then moved into podcasting, who basically said I had to almost relearn the way I was going to perform because the expectations are different. Right? Podcast audiences tend to skew younger, they tend to skew more diverse. And so a lot of them just sort of expect to hear conversations that sound authentic, that don't sound like, the broadcast voice that we're used to. And as you said, much more diverse. And so, yeah, there's a lot more openness in podcasting, generally speaking, to sort of sound like your audience and sound like you would sound if you were, not even recording yourself. And as far as your first question, in terms of some of the solutions, I mean, some of it I think has to do with just representation overall. I mean, one of the themes in the book is that sometimes journalists don't even talk to anybody about how they're supposed to be looking or sounding, but they just turn on the television or radio and they see a lack of diversity as far as of appearance. They see the same hairstyles, they see the same types of broadcast voices. They just assume that that's the way they're supposed to do it when they're on air. And so just having more representation is just means a lot. It's a big deal. And then as far as people who are involved in journalism, I mean, everyone from professors to advisors to people in newsrooms, I would hope that they would be open to at least sort of just proactively speaking to students and to people who were recently hired about, okay, let's talk about the way that you want to appear on air. What are your goals? How do you want to present yourself? And maybe there's a back and forth. I mean, obviously you have this. There are some norms of professionalism that you have to follow, but it should be an open conversation rather than just here's a consultant. Here's how you have to dress. Here's how we want you to talk. I mean, I would hope it would be more of an open conversation where the two sides can talk about, okay,
Elia,
what we both want.
In the very few final seconds that I've got,
sure.
I want to make clear that when you talk about the myth of neutrality within the book, you're very specific. You're talking about the myth of neutrality, given that the notion that is misguided that everyone should look and sound and be the same, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so neutrality here just basically means this is sort of, I think, a myth that there is a middle ground that you can be that will appeal to everyone, that'll be broadly palatable to the entire audience. I think that's a myth, and hope that would change.
Thank you, Elia, for this great conversation, and really, I thank you for having me be part of this great project.
Thank you, Javier. I appreciate it.
Good luck with the book and future projects. After the break, we will tell you about So Harlem, an incubator for fashion and related new ventures here in New York. We talked to Olivia Smasham and Donna Drew, designers in residence at the location.